I offer these every week along with a guided meditation. Just click the subscribe link below to be notified through YouTube when I post the latest recording. Or if you'd like to join us live, which would be great, just go into the description section below and follow the link along to be able to sign up for free. So I'd like to begin by responding to several questions that came in during my preliminary riff. We have an informal start 15 minutes or so before our formal beginning at 6 p.m. Pacific time. And I was responding to a question that's very, very profound and at the center of deep practice that came in, and I spoke to it. And the question was essentially, in the language of early Buddhism, what's the difference between that which is conditioned and potentially that which is unconditioned? And why does that matter? And how do we practice with that? In other traditions, people use words like God or spirit, divine, Allah, Yahweh, other terms to the absolute, the mystery, to refer to that which is meaningfully distinct from the conditioned, which is to say, dominoes falling, the cause and effect processes of our Big Bang universe. There's a pointing to that which is meaningfully distinct. If it were not meaningfully distinct, there's no need for other words. I wrote about this at some length in the chapter on timelessness in my book, Neurodharma. If you want to see my own approach to this, as well as a lot of references to what other people have to say, including those in the Buddhist tradition currently in the West who deny the possibility of the unconditioned, or at least consider it to be unknowable and therefore irrelevant to practice. So it's a big thing. So very briefly here, I want to kind of speak to some questions that came in, which in some ways can be helpful as we get into the nitty-gritty, which I hope to get into, of practical wisdom for relationships, especially when they're problematic. So Anne asked where are we here? No, it was Deb, a question of how can we know what is unconditioned through conditioned means? And classically, you will find people making the point that any idea we might have about God or the divine or timelessness, unconditionality, any idea we might have about that is conditioned. And any evidence that we seek for the existence of that which is not conditioned, unlike the conditioned universe, any evidence is occurring in the conditioned universe, so it doesn't prove anything. I acknowledge all that, and I think the path of wisdom and also intellectual clarity is to acknowledge all that we don't know, and to give up trying to prove whether there is an unconditioned realm, domain, ground, words break down, or not. I'm not trying to prove it. So that's part one. Now that said, if there actually is an absolute, and I'll use that term, distinct from the relative, if there is unconditioned, distinct from conditioned, if there is a kind of timelessness in which time is occurring, it either is or it isn't. If it is, one way of regarding this, which is embedded in the Buddhist tradition in many ways, is that conditioned and unconditioned, samsara and nirvana, are intertwined. They are meaningfully distinct, and they are intertwined. They are co-occurring. The conditioned, by definition, doesn't change. It's a field or ground, space, something or other, dimension, in which change is occurring. They're still intertwined. And if the ordinary mind is right here, right now with you and me and all of us, right here, right now, including physical objects like my gong. If all of that is entwined with that which is timeless and eternal, unborn and undying, well, it's not surprising that conditioned experiences and mental processes could find ways to intuit and have a sense of that which is eternal and unchanging. From the standpoint of practice, which is where I'll finish on this key point here, my reading of the surviving written record of the Buddhist teachings is that the Buddha himself was crystal clear and forthright about, and matter of fact, about the unconditioned. Even just calling it, by the way, the unconditioned is problematic. I sometimes use the term unconditionality as a way of getting at it. He was very clear about it, and he was very clear that the ultimate freedom from the incessant passing away in ordinary reality is through contact with and a sense of timelessness, which he described as the ultimate refuge, the farthest shore, the island in a river of suffering. So I invite you to explore this for yourself and not take things on belief. Maybe use certain suggestions like the ones I'm offering, as well as those from others, as pointing out instructions, send you in a direction of inquiry and exploration, and then you most importantly find for yourself. I will say that certain teachers for me are extremely clear and helpful about this. Hamid or Almas, the founder of the Diamond School, the Diamond approach, extremely clear. Stephen Snyder and Tina Rasmussen, friends and teachers of mine, both extremely clear. I'm sure there are others as well. I'm pretty centered in the Buddhist tradition in terms of this territory. So finding people that really speak to you could be really good for you. Okay. Then I used the term last, not knowing. And this is very relevant for a segue into relationships. So somebody asked me, Rick, what do you mean not knowing? I've heard that forever. What do you mean by that? What does that mean? So I want to call out here a friend of mine and a very esteemed colleague, Steve Hayes, the founder of ACT, Acceptance and Commitment Training or Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, which has produced well over 1,000, probably last count maybe on the order of 1,400 peer-reviewed studies on ACT in various settings. And Steve and I are going to do a series of 3 2-hour workshops free online. Actually, no, they're going to be a fundraiser for the Global Compassion Coalition. So sorry about that. Early next year, and we were talking about that and also talking about a 2-day workshop we're going to be teaching in New Orleans. And the point I'm making here is to credit Steve. So I asked him, what's very alive for you these days? What's really fresh? And he got into an obscure term called idionomics, which is a statistical mathematical term for the fact that everyone's an individual in a nutshell. That's really interesting him these days, which is a real divergence from the standard approach in the medical model in psychology that lumps people into categories. And then they have a diagnostic code and they can get insurance reimbursement for their therapeutic treatment. And Steve is a very clear and well-substantiated critic of that approach. So individualism. And then I replied, that's really interesting, because what comes up for me about that is putting together the importance of not knowing rather than lumping people into categories, including people in our relationships. And what happens when we approach other people with that openness of not knowing, not being so sure, not quickly categorizing them, not assuming about them, bringing a freshness, an openness to them that hopefully we bring to our own experience during meditation. Think what happens in our relationships when we come from not knowing with other people. We're seeing clearly, we're not but we're not so caught up in our categories, our labels, our verbal narrative about them. It's more like it's fresh receptivity. Well, when other people experience that, they're more likely to feel like they matter. We are receiving them as the totality of them. My parents were both very loving and decent, and for complicated reasons, I'm sure some of which having to do with me, I felt routinely that they were talking to someone who was displaced from the real me by a foot or so. And that led me with them to feel like I did not matter. I also felt with my peers that I was just slotted into this category, kind of shy, nerdy, smart kid, quiet in a corner. And there too, I did not feel like I mattered because I wasn't seen for the whole of me. I was categorized in some way that wasn't true for me. So when we open into the sense of the freshness of what we're receiving in the present before categorizing, that also gives us the sense that we matter, because it really draws us into our experiencing right here, right now. So you can see the coming together of allowing others to be just who they are. I mean, we're accepting what we're recognizing there, even if we see some issues with it. We recognize the reality of it. We accept that it is what it is. We're not trying to immediately make it something different from what it is. We're not trying to shove a square peg into a round hole of our categories with another person. When we do that with them, they feel like they matter more, and we feel like we matter more. And that's a beautiful thing. I was speaking recently with somebody else who just made the comment that has haunted me since, that so much of what ails the world these days and so much of what's behind the swing into authoritarianism in so many countries, including America, is the fact that so many people, certainly many, many younger men, feel like they just don't matter. And that creates a lot of fertile ground for support for authoritarianism, and also it involves a lot of suffering. So this topic matters about not mattering. And so I talked about that. Steve thoroughly approved, and we're going to go forward with all that. But I wanted to give credit for the seed of this material about not knowing and mattering, which he and I will be exploring, more online. And so when we think about how to interact with other people, the Buddha gave us a lot of guidelines. And I'd like to review some of them very briefly and then open it up to questions, particularly coming through the chat about difficult situations. And I've seen a number of them already. So 6 guidelines for wise speech I find extremely helpful, and also helpful for how we interact with each other. First rule of wise speech is that it is well intended. And this is an area full of opportunity. Why are we opening our mouth? My friend Daniel, who occasionally guest teaches here, learned this acronym from somebody else, the acronym WAIT, W-A-I-T, meaning, why am I talking? Or another version of that, waste. Why am I still talking? And it's not that we should muzzle ourselves. It's more, why am I saying this? Why am I dropping that comment into the chat? Why am I sending that fairly intense email that I ended up sending to somebody yesterday? Why am I doing this? What's my motive? And is it a wise motive? In the collection of my motives and the ways in which I'm being pulled in multiple directions with somebody, when I add it all up, what are the best motivations to find inside myself that are the basis for my communicating? Why am I talking? What's my purpose here? And the Buddha recommended, make sure your purpose is a good one, at least for yourself. Now, sometimes, why am I saying this is because I've got to get it off my chest, and I have a right to do that. You sure were willing to get stuff off your chest. Well, guess what? Now it's my turn. Okay, that's hopefully a beneficial purpose. But it's a key question. What's the benefit here versus harm? First of all, do no harm, including to yourself. Doing harms to others harms you as well, eventually. So that's the first criterion, the first rule, if you will, the first standard of speech that is wise, is that it's well intended. I'll confess that I still communicate in ways that fail this criterion. Speech that just comes from exasperation, or just proving myself right, or just establishing dominance or superiority in some way, or reclaiming my standing rather, as the top dog. That is not well intended. Trying to drill my point into the black box of their mind over there, that's not well intended. You might make a little list for yourself in really practical terms. What is speech that is well intended and not well intended? And then you can also think about people in your life. You can ask yourself, hey, is what they are saying well intended or not? And by being clearer about what it means to be well intended yourself and holding yourself to that standard, cleaning up your side of the street first, that puts you in a much better position to see more clearly the complicated, multiple motivations of other people, and increasingly puts you in a position, if you consider it appropriate and well intended, to explore with them what their intentions are. What's their why for saying things to you? My wife and I have been married 43 years. I think we're on the eve of 43. I think I'll do the math later. Anyway, we're still working stuff out where basically we ask each other, when the dust settles a little, why did you say that? Why did you feel the need to introduce that topic right there? What was going on in you, inside you, that led to that? Now, of course, obviously, many people we can't really, talk in that way with, but sometimes it's really appropriate to just ask people, what's behind what you're saying? Why are you telling me this right now? What do you hope to gain here? What do you hope to contribute? Do you hope to contribute something to me? Are you trying to help me in some way? Are you trying to benefit me in some way? Like, why? Why are you saying this? Including, why are you adding that tone to it? So that's the first standard. I'll go through the remaining 5 very quickly because they really are rested on the first one, of having good intentions, being there in good faith. The other 5 standards are speech is wise, that is accurate. So we may leave out, we don't say everything, but what we do say is truthful, it's accurate, it's honest. We're not lying. Speech is wise, that is timely, comes in at a useful moment. speech is wise that is actually beneficial in its result, not just well intended, but actually beneficial. And last, speech is wise that is offered without harsh tone. Now, harsh tone varies, but disparaging others, that's harsh. Coming in with an intensity that is one or two or three levels above the current emotional intensity in the interaction, that can be pretty harsh, pretty abrasive. Name calling, accusatory, prosecutorial, fault finding, yelling, dishes breaking. That's harsh. Where there's a lot of opportunity for people is around tone. And for me, it's been really interesting to explore how to say what needs to be said without harsh tone. And if you can get interested in that, it's really cool because you realize, wow, I'm much more effective when I communicate without that harsh tone. And it's really interesting to acquire the sophisticated skills of communicating with gravity and dignity, seriousness, sometimes intensity, sometimes even fieriness, without crossing lines. Now, obviously, those lines vary depending on the culture and the history of the relationship. And most fundamentally, it's about your own sense of where your integrity lies. I think most of us know when we added some topspin to the content of what we were saying that was really not necessary to communicate it and had negative consequences. That topspin is what that other person reacted to. Now, sometimes what we have to do is reserve the right to communicate with a certain topspin and to make room for other people communicating with a certain topspin, especially in the early phase of a heated interaction, which tend to go like this, all right? They start off, they get kind of heated, but then hopefully they come to a soft landing. So I think it's important to not tone police too much in the very beginning and to make kind of room to have a little bit of rough and tumble, room to breathe, in which there's learning along the way, at least on your side of the street, as to, rewinding the whole interaction, how might you have entered into it and how might you have communicated in it in ways that did not have any harsh tone and in ways that you would be, you are happy about. You would have been happier if you had communicated without that tone while still saying what needed to be said from your standpoint. Okay, so those are the major criteria. And with regard to our own internal relationships here, I expect you to communicate with wise speech in this setting. I try to do the same. I'm not going to be perfect. You're not going to be perfect necessarily. We have to give each other some room to breathe here. But basically, the standard is wise speech as I've described it here, including first and foremost, well-intended and without harsh tone. In other words, in particular, not disparaging. Okay. So now I want to take a look at some particular questions that have come in. I want to really pick up on something that my friend, Dr. Brenda Dixon Gottschalk, hello, the East Coast, has said here. It's 4 minutes past the hour. Well, as a Black woman, I've often had to do that establishing of who I am in so many situations where white folks seem to pre-categorize me, be it in shopping situations, doctor's offices, and in professional circumstances. So establishing my agency, really important. I really want to underscore from my standpoint and appreciate what Brenda is saying here. Certainly also as a Black woman, I'm a white man. To me, it's really important to, be spacious around communications from people not like me, super important. And also to say that often, as someone who, in my case, has witnessed so many interactions that have gone off the rails. People come into my office, couple, and off the rails. Okay, really quickly. What do we do then? So one of the really, really useful things is exactly what Brenda is saying here. It's establishing who we are in a situation, initially through our own gravitas, our own grounding, our own self-respect, our own treating ourselves like we matter, our own fundamental stance of, I matter whether you think so or not. I matter to me, I matter in the world, I matter to others, however you categorize me. I am beyond your categories, in my own right, standing here before you, looking into your eyes. Now, each of us should adapt and can adapt what I'm saying to your own particular situation. I come from a certain place. Sometimes just taking that stance is dangerous. It certainly probably would have been dangerous for a Black woman during Jim Crow in the American South and North, certainly. So, we have to be careful about these things. But if it's possible to take that kind of stand about who you are in that interaction with the seriousness, that can be extremely helpful. And interactions then tend to not go off the rails so much if you have yourself established your footing from the get-go. And often it's literally just a matter of not coming in, smoking hot, not coming in with a lot of attitude, while on the other hand, coming in with the qualities that we explore during the meditation of quiet, receptive presence. And that itself tends to settle other people down. Kind of slowing down, being curious, stepping out of the scripting that other people are trying to cast you into in the very beginning. Like they say something quickly, they want a quick response. You don't give it to them. You take an extra beat or 3 or 10 before replying. They want to come in dominating. They want you to subordinate yourself, but you don't do that. They're leaning into your face. You don't back away. I don't mean getting into some violent encounter. I just mean physically, literally sometimes, and also more generally. You just step out of their movie. You refuse to validate their categories of you and their agenda, even unconscious agenda. You're not playing that game. You're here with a different purpose. Just establishing this can be incredibly helpful in the very beginning. Okay, Jules, 7 minutes past the hour. How do we move on from our attachment to things going well and being a good communication if someone else meets us with chronic rejection or blame? Sometimes wanting to do right things leads us to continue being attacked or attached. So it's interesting that I last week I talked about listening and deep listening, 4 factors of good listening: availability, attention, empathy, and responsiveness to what's been said. And one of the really recurring themes in the chat was, what do we do with others who are not good listeners? Right? How can I get them to be better? That's understandable, by the way. How can I get them to be better? So you want my crash course on how to get them to be better? Because it's been a life journey for me, trying to get them to be better. And I will finish my crash course with some, hopefully, more ultimate perspective. So first of all, take care of your side of the street. Practice unilateral virtue. Reduce causes for them to take issue with you. Make sure that you are taking the high road yourself. Know that you are doing that. That's really helpful. Second, know what it is that you're really wanting from that other person. Be clear in your own mind, concretely, operationally, specifically. What would it look like if they were a better listener? What are you really asking for here? Third, talk about talking. Sometimes direct communication gets explosive quickly. If it does, it can really help to talk about talking. That might look like saying to another person, hey, would it be okay with you to talk a little bit about how we interact with each other? Because there's certain, I have a bit of a wish in that regard. So I wondered if we could talk about how we talk with each other. So you're getting consent around the topic. Okay. Fourth, I think it can be really helpful to practice what's called nonviolent communication as a way of expressing a request for the future. Rather than blaming or arguing about the past, requests for the future. And the structure of nonviolent communication, really straightforward. It's great to know it. Essentially is when X happens, I feel Y because I need Z. So, and then this is not exactly, classic NVC, nonviolent communication, but very often there can be followed by a request. So from now on, I request such and such. Now, what you might do is you might start with the request, because even describing past events could be explosive. So you might simply say, I would love to talk that here's another tip, that it's about both of you, not just them. I would love it if when we talk with each other, generally don't interrupt each other. And also generally have roughly equal airtime when we get together or talk on the phone. Would you like that? Would that be okay? Then you see what happens. Now, very often, other people will say, well, that's what we always do anyway. And if you like, you could reply, as I did with my mother one time when we had a similar interaction. You might say, okay, great, there'll be no problem going forward. But then you've established that as a standard and understanding. So the next time you interact and they violate that standard, in a gentle way, you could just say, oh, pardon me, I thought we agreed we weren't going to interrupt each other. You'll see the other person being startled often. What? Wait, did I? Oh, shoot, I did agree to that. All right. And, most people will kind of rise in their behavior. And some people will absolutely refuse to abide by agreements, or they won't make them in the first place. And that tells you that your only option at that point is to shrink the relationship, to resize the relationship as best you can to a size that is healthy for you. And if you're still stuck with somebody, an ex, raising children together, an aging parent you're duty bound to care for, who's being a real kind of beast about it, then you just try to manage it as best you can. But if you don't put a clear request on the table about how you'd like them to be a better communicator, you will not know for sure that you put it on the table, and they probably won't know exactly what you mean. Now, if you don't want to jump directly into the request, it can really help to just go into the nonviolent communication by saying something like, well, when we're talking and just in the flow, I get interrupted. You could make it, by the way, not about them even. So it's easier for them to deal with. When I'm talking with my friends, like you, and a little bit of interrupting just for clarity, or maybe they misheard a word, or they just want to make sure they understand what I'm saying, no big deal, natural. But frequent interrupting, and then interrupting that then creates a transition into the other person holding forth for the next several minutes in a row, and my own topic and my own interest gets sidelined. When that happens, that's the X, described neutrally and accurately. When that happens, I feel sad and unheard, and I feel hurt, and like I don't matter to that other person, because now we're moving into the the need, because I need to feel that I count in my relationships with people who count to me. I need to feel that I count too, and I count for them, that I matter to them. And I have a need for that. And I think a lot of people do as well, of course. And I need to feel a certain reciprocity, a certain even Steven in my significant relationships, that there's a flow that goes both ways of giving and taking that's roughly equal, especially over reasonable periods of time. So these are needs I have. So on the basis of those needs, I request that we try not to interrupt each other generally, and that we also make sure that there's roughly equal airtime for each of us. Would that be okay? That would be an example. I'm doing it a little formally. In real life, we tend to do it more sloppily and informally. That's okay. And actually, in my experience, and I've gotten questions like this that makes this sound like you could only do this in a therapist office or only in a a new age workshop of some kind. No, actually, these methods developed by Marshall Rosenberg for nonviolent communication and other methods have been forged in the crucible of enabling Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland to communicate with each other, or Palestinians and Israelis to communicate with each other. Really intense gang members, of different gangs, or the parents of gang members who've killed each other, how they can communicate with each other. The more that things are going off the rails and are full of heat and intensity, the more important it is to bring these forms to them and to stand by your own forms. Whatever they do, you can stay with what works for you. So I got a private question that's really significant. And I'm going to not read it directly, but I'm going to kind of broaden it out. So what do we do with people? And we have some kind of relationship with them. Maybe they're a family member, or it could be a work situation and they have authority. They're further up the hierarchy. And they communicate with us. Maybe they send us emails, or they text us, long text, or they want to get on the phone with us and it's awkward to leave. What do we do when basically they're not there with good intentions? They're there to bully us, to reestablish their dominance, or to just vent and get stuff off their chest with no interest in us. What do we do when, in the structure of Martin Buber, I and thou, and I and it, they are itting us, including ways of just categorizing us. They're presuming that we are in a certain category. They're presuming, for example, that we are one down. They're presuming that we just have to take their crap and we can't do anything about it. What do you do when you realize that for another person, they are not seeing you fully, and they don't want to see you fully? They're not going to see you fully. And they are orienting to you as a means to their ends, not as a being in your own right. Right? It's a big, big deal. I want to say, first of all, sometimes we just have to take it. And often it's because we're making a choice that nets out a lot of things and just basically says the price I'm paying to gain certain various benefits is to just let them spew. And internally, I'm just watching the time go by. I just have to take it. Sometimes we're in situations like in a military environment, maybe, or a prison environment, where we literally have to take it. We just have to take it. That's the way it is. Okay. Sometimes it's like that. Often, though, there are things we can do not just inside our own mind. So for sure, inside our own mind, we can practice with what's happening in lots of ways. I do little things sometimes, like I move myself into curiosity about the psychopathology on the other side of the table or telephone. And I'm just kind of curious about it. And I reflect on it, like the neuroticism of that other person. And I allow myself to, um, you don't have to be a trained clinical psychologist to do this, where you just kind of wonder. You move into wonder and to some extent not knowing and curiosity. That's a way to not be so affected by them. Also, compassion for maybe their own history that led them to be this way. Even if they're not particularly suffering in the present, you can have compassion for their past. That can enable them to have less impact on you. And to be really clear inside your own mind that you don't want them to upset you. Your primary interest is not getting them to change, but rather getting the impacts to change, on the impacts on you to change. That's really important. We can get very caught up in struggling with our external adversaries, and we can lose sight of the real aim, the real prize that we want to keep our eyes on, which is how we experience ourselves internally, our moment-to-moment stream of consciousness. This is really important. We can get incredibly caught up in trying to prove things to other people or getting them to change, and they're not going to change. So the best thing that we can change is their impact on us inside our own being. All that said, I myself, when somebody, I had occasion to say to somebody what my politics were, my fundamental political views and stances. And I reflected for a bit. I said, well, my politics basically boils down to two things. I love children, and I don't like bullies. Those two broad principles are really, they have a lot of implications. They're guiding principles. So I don't like bullies. I don't like being bullied myself. I don't like it when you, including the person who asked me that question, is bullying. And I don't want to participate in it. So then I look for ways to declare my own stance about what I will take and what I won't. So, if someone's trying to manipulate me or bully me, one of the most powerful things you can do is to name that. Bullies hate to have the bullying named. Name it. Describe it. Say back to them what it sounds like they want from you. Right? Name it. Blow up the pretense by just naming what's happening. You're not resisting what's happening. You're simply naming it. And you're communicating that, as the Buddha did on his night of awakening, purportedly, I see you. I understand the game you're running here. That's really, really powerful. And you can do it in kind of polite and gentle ways sometimes, maybe with a little humor, like, I'll make a little. So let's suppose that you're in an interaction. Suddenly, you're somebody up the chain of command, your boss, starts talking to you about a third person, another person, trying to get you to agree with them about that other person. And then from history that if you do agree with them, your boss will then tell that other person that you agree with the boss about that other person. Whoa, that's not good. So maybe, having been down that road before, you might say something gently and humorously to your boss a little bit early on, like, well, so let me make sure I understand this, boss. You are telling me about one of my colleagues that I have a working relationship with, right? Is that what's happening here? Well, just naming it obviously identifies that it's problematic behavior by the boss. And you might then ask, so let me make sure I understand this. Why are you telling me about someone that you supervise who I have a horizontal working relationship with that needs to be good for the sake of our whole organization. I'm not understanding your purposes here. Can you help me understand? Well, in these various ways, you are blowing up the script by commenting on it in subversive and very effective kinds of ways, right? You're not conflicting with the boss directly. You're not resisting their power directly. You're just asking for information, right? That's a very, very powerful thing to do. So I think in general, it's very effective to basically challenge the frame that the bully is operating in. You know, maybe the frame is that they just get to say whatever they want without any consequences. Well, you might want to challenge that frame. So you might want to say, well, let me make sure I understand this here. Is what you're saying company policy, or are you just blowing off some steam here? Or are you inviting my opinions about what you're saying? I don't know what's going on here. What are you looking for here? You know, that then holds the other person to account for what it is they're saying. You say, and my point broadly is to find your own way, but to retain a kind of freedom yourself to disrupt the framing in which you are being treated like an it and getting sucked into some kind of role that is serving the agenda, the devices of that boss or relative, parent-in-law, ex, landlord, etc. Okay? So I want to see, as we finish up here, if there's some other things that have come rolling in that, hopefully have been helpful. Yes, I'll finish here on Jamie's comment. I think many of us pull back at the mere suggestion that we do this. I'm watching attendance dropping rapidly. And yeah, we're coming to the end of the time. But I think that in my personal experience, many people hover in this middle place that's the worst of all possible places, in which they don't assert themselves reasonably along the way and then eventually get explosive at the other end. What's much better is to be more flexible in how we interact with other people who are difficult for us and look for new ways of operating in the interaction that will blow up problematic scripts with other people and give us more room to breathe, give us more freedom of action with other people. And especially if you've been socialized, as many, many people have, and notably girls and women broadly, to generalize as a class of people, if you've been socialized to not challenge authority, not question authority, and to not move into process comments in which you pop into the bird's eye view to comment on the process, what's happening, then it can feel really challenging for someone like me to roll in and say, well, actually, you can say those things. You might think, well, Rick, you're a dude, you're white, you're tall, you're got a PhD, you're you're a mindfulness teacher, whatever, you can do that. And I would say, yeah, and throughout history, there are so many examples of people who've been subordinated by others, who have been able to speak truth to power with gravity and with a retaining an inner liberation of mind that has been very, very consequential.